My name is Browne. Like the Minister, actually, I used to represent a Somerset constituency in Parliament, which is the British Parliament. Those of you who aren't British, Somerset is in the southwest of England, a very nice part of the country you should visit sometime. And I now run Canning House, which is the, well, we would say, and I'd like to think, is the main forum for exchange between Britain and Latin America here in London. And we host a whole range of different events looking at different aspects of that relationship. Now we've got a panel from now until 11:15 to talk about the sort of big macro geopolitical context of the relationship. And what I propose to do is everybody can, rather than me introduce them, they can just explain, very crisply, name and position, maybe a little bit of background, so you know who everyone is on the panel and can cite them. And then we'll do a broad question, and then we'll get it rolling, and we'll leave plenty of time for your contributions and discussions as well. So let's just sort of run through in order, just introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. Nick Zimmerman, founding partner of a political risk consulting firm called Dinámica Americas. Previously, senior policy advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power at the time, and before that, White House National Security Council Director for Brazil and the Southern Cone. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Maria Luisa Puig. I'm a director for Latin America at Eurasia Group. Within Latin America, I focus more specifically on Chile, Colombia, and Peru. At Eurasia Group, we focus more on the politics side of the story. And I was previously with Oxford Analytica, and before that, I was a correspondent for Reuters. I studied here in the UK at the LSE, and previously in the US at Stanford.
So I'm Rob Tinline. I'm Director for the Americas in the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. So I've been doing that for a couple of years, but I've been a diplomat for the United Kingdom for over 25 years. And my first posting was in Bogota.
Antonio Patriota, currently Ambassador of Brazil to the United Kingdom. I've been a diplomat for 40 years, so that's a few more years than my colleague. Previously Ambassador to the United States, to the United Nations, and Foreign Minister of Brazil.
Wow. I just realized that in the conversation before, I didn't get a microphone put on, I don't think. So anyway, can you hear me better now? Let's get the ball rolling. Let's go in reverse order, and especially drawing on the ambassador's extensive expertise over many decades to sort of set the sort of context of how does I'm conscious that Latin America is not a country. So there are lots of different views in different Latin American countries, and indeed within different Latin American countries. And seen that in Brazil or Argentina in the last year have changed as a result of their presidential election, their outlook significantly. But in so much as we can try and look at it in the round, what is Latin America's take on the global situation at the moment? What is the Latin American perspective? And how does Latin America see itself playing a global role in trying to resolve some of the difficulties that we collectively face? It's a big question, but I think it helps to sort of set the context and everyone to understand where the panelists are sort of coming from. So, Ambassador, would you like to start with that one?
Thank you, Jeremy. Well, I think I should start by saying that I can't claim to speak on behalf of Latin America. Latin America is very diverse, even though from afar it may look to a certain extent homogeneous, and it does have, of course, a history that is marked by Iberian presence, as well as other European countries in the Caribbean, for example. But since Brazil has invested heavily in diplomacy and has an embassy in every Latin American country, not in every Caribbean country at this stage, but we intend to have in every independent country within Caribbean and Latin America. Perhaps my words will reflect an overall trend or give you a flavor of how we see ourselves in the world. But I'll speak on behalf of Brazil then. One of the first aspects I think that I should highlight is Brazil's investment in diplomacy. We are possibly the only country in the Americas where all ambassadors are career. There may be one or two exceptions where nearly all are career. So we have by far the largest network in Latin America and the Caribbean of embassies abroad. Brasilia today, although a comparatively young city of 64 years old, is the Latin American capital with the largest number of foreign embassies. So this allows us to keep in touch with interlocutors from the entire region as well as beyond. And when we invest in diplomacy, I think it's also important to say that we invest in peace. We haven't had any major war or even skirmish with any of our 10 neighbors. And after Russia and China, Brazil is the country with the largest number of land borders in the world, so 10 land borders. We haven't had a problem since 1870s. And this is not, let's say, the product of chance. I think it is very much linked to the investment in diplomacy. All our land borders were diplomatically negotiated, sometimes through arbitration, other times through bilateral negotiations, in one case through a purchase. And this has allowed us to develop cooperative relations with all neighbors and to engage in what should really be our priorities, because we're among the most unequal regions of the world. We need to invest in education, health, social development, industrial development. Although there are many success stories in Latin America, I think this is what the main focus is. As you know, Brazil will be hosting the G20 this year, and the three main priorities, not surprisingly, are number one, a world alliance against hunger and poverty. Number two, strong emphasis on sustainability, including the three pillars, economic development, social justice, as well as environmental awareness and progress. And in third place, improved international governance. So this is my additional point, that through investing in diplomacy and peace, we have tried to play a very active role within the multilateral system. We are the developing country that has been elected the most often to the United Nations Security Council. In fact, the UK supports Brazil as a potential permanent member in a reform and expanded Security Council, which is something we greatly appreciate and which we believe reflects a high level of confidence in Brazil's international role. So these are the main ideas that I think I need to share at the outset.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we can obviously look to come back to some of those on role for Latin America in a reformed UN and G20 and the BRICS, indeed, which were not mentioned, but Brazil plays a prominent role. Rob, maybe, I mean, you actually probably, in your position in the Foreign Office, are well placed to try and paint a sort of more general picture of Latin America and trends and how they're seen, particularly from here in London.
Yeah. Thank you. I won't try and speak for Latin America, but I will speak about how I see Latin America from where I sit. So look, one of the things that always strikes me in the region is that when you look at how regions vote in the United Nations, the Americas, and I tend to look across the Americas, but it's true of Latin America as part of that region, votes in the same way as the UK more often than any other region apart from Europe. Now, clearly, there are variations in that. It's not every country in Latin America, there are different views, but if you look across the regional groupings, we are often in the same place.
And Rob, I'm interrupted, but would you say, because of course there have been some significant shifts in the leadership of major Latin American countries, I mean, take, say, Colombia as an example, I think most people would accept that the current presidency is a break in terms of its attitude towards the United States and the West compared to previous incumbents. But you think those sort of general outlooks and affiliations hold true even if the individuals change?
I think a lot of it comes down to sort of, as Mr. was just saying about how much he expects policy to change if there's a change of government in the United Kingdom, international policy. Actually, when it comes to climate, human rights, some of the health issues, some of the Geneva-type issues in the United Nations system, actually, whichever side you're on of the political spectrum, actually, Latin American governments are consistently in a similar sort of place to us. It's not every government on every occasion at every time, but actually, if you look across the sweep of the region, on a lot of the values issues, that we are dealing with. A lot of the building an international system, believing in the international system, investing in diplomacy to try to make the international system work better, actually you find that we are often in the same place, and more often in the same place than we are with many other regions in the world. So there is a, there is a set of values and interests and international priorities that, in the general, unite the UK, many of our friends and partners, and Latin America. And I do think that endures through quite a lot of change of government. So I've been doing this job for 2 years. While in the job, I've sort of gone to more than half the countries in the region. And there's just a couple of themes that I would pull out, sort of traveling around the region. I always come back more impressed by the resilience of countries than I go out. It's quite easy to sit and look at the region from afar and think, I've dealt with, from our end, enough crises in various countries over the last 2 years, but actually, generally, again, not every time, but in every country, but generally I've been impressed by the resilience of the institutions, whether that's the state institutions, the political institutions, the economic institutions. Generally, countries have been able to find a way through some really, really difficult problems and crises. But coming back to the point about equality, I'm also really deeply struck about how pervasive some insecurity is. And how pervasive inequality is across the region. Reading the Canning House report that they issued this month, I think, it has a statistic in there that really leapt out at me. A third of murders in the world happen in Latin America, and Latin America has 10% of the population of the world. So, there are some really entrenched problems there that when we talk about geopolitics and all of that, we just shouldn't lose sight of some of those underlying security issues which really affect people's lives in a way that the geopolitics doesn't always. And I found that in a wider range of countries in the region than I was expecting. There are certain countries where you go to and you sort of expect security to be top of the, as in kind of personal crime type security to be top of the agenda. And actually I found that to be a more pervasive concern than I had anticipated in a wider range of countries. So there's a couple of themes that I'd pick up, and no doubt we'll get into geopolitics a bit more and climate and other issues a bit more as we go around, but I'll leave it there for the moment.
Great, thank you. Ria, your opening thoughts, if you like, on the big picture.
First to pick up on what you have just said, because I was actually looking at the remarks, at the closing remarks of the security conference last year, right? And I think that two things strike me from there. One is indeed that when we talk about Latin America, we talk about Latin America as a whole, and there are like so many different nuances, and as you mentioned, even differences within the specific countries, and those differences get accentuated with electoral cycles as well, right? When we see changes in the leadership, particularly with presidents that have a very specific position on certain geopolitical aspects. The second has to do on security, right? When we talk about security, really security encompasses so many things. Like it's about defense, it's about cybersecurity, AI, right? Like look how AI has changed in really in 1 year's time, and how it will probably evolve over the next week, months, and coming years. And one of the key issues on that broad security theme is precisely urban security crime, right? So that is at the very, very top of voters' concerns. That is definitely the main driver of public discontent in the region. And we have seen very high levels of public discontent in the region, driving protests, driving elections, affecting the political capital of the leaders to pursue reforms. So if we assume that this is a problem that doesn't have a short-term resolution, that means that people are going to remain very angry with the status quo and with their political leaders, and that in the next electoral cycle we will probably see potentially a shift to the other side of the political spectrum as a punishment or as a rejection to the incumbents that were unable to do much in order to deliver with this stuff, right? And this matters because it does matter for the broader geopolitical position of those leaders, not necessarily on the core issues that you were talking about, right? Like the aim for equality, for human rights, for climate, but on more specific stances of countries and leaders with respect to some issues, right? China, US, for instance.
Thank you. Nick.
Yeah, so to take a step back, and also same caveat, I certainly can't speak for Brazil, Latin America, or the UK, but to take a step back geopolitically, we heard this morning a bit about, it is a very common refrain to talk about how we are in unprecedented times, and whether we are or we aren't, it's clear that things are changing in the world. It's becoming more multipolar. There are growing poles of regionalization. There are it's a G20 type of world, and there are many different ways to characterize that. But I think it has very profound implications for U.S. foreign policy writ large and in the Americas, and by extension also the U.K. I think what's happening in the world as it becomes, as power becomes more diverse, is the Americas only grows in importance geopolitically and strategically. Robert just spoke about many of the shared democratic values between Europe and the Americas. I echo that. In many ways, much of the heart of the democratic world, lowercase d, runs through Europe and the Americas. Of course, there are many democracies in other parts of the world too, but these are highly concentrated with deep historic ties, complex histories, of course, but a natural starting point, I think, in reimagining a 21st century where there are many different poles of power and where there are concerns, at least in my country, in this administration, about what is typically called global democratic backsliding. I think one of the points of the spear, which is an unfortunate phrase to use because, of course, we're talking about giving people democratic agency and power, but is that fight. I think it's a fight that the Lula government has identified in part because of its own lived experience, but even beyond that, I think as a global phenomenon, I applaud their focus on some of these issues in its hosting of the G20, which Ambassador Patriota mentioned. But if you look at democratic norms, climate change and sustainability, food security, which we also heard about this morning, innovative agriculture, you can't talk about what that kind of a world works like in a competent and efficient manner if you don't include all of the Americas. And so it's an opportune moment.
And that, that's the point. Let me put another take. Let's sort of broaden this, because clearly, we're moving to a more sort of G20, less sort of North Atlantic, Northern Hemisphere world, if you can put it in those terms, and countries at the top table like the Mexico or for that, Indonesia or others who may not have been in the same way a generation or two ago. At the same time, you may disagree with this, but many would think that there's a sort of bipolarization taking place to a greater effect. And there are two visions. It's often portrayed in these terms in the media and elsewhere. There's a sort of democratic and an autocratic way forward, and countries are feeling that they need to be aligned with one or the other. And I think some would reject that analysis and would say they don't need to be, and they can align themselves separately. So how do we see that sort of tension pushing people into silos? Or maybe I can be more specific. What is the US's role in Latin America now? How is the US perceived in the major capitals of Latin America? Is there a need to feel that US leadership is important, or in some cases almost a rejection of the idea of US leadership as having a sort of writ that runs down the spine of the Americas? So how do people see some of those issues, whether there is a sort of concentration into two columns, and specifically where the US stands in the strategic analysis of Latin Americans compared to, say, a generation ago? Why don't you start?
Thank you.
We don't have to do everything like, come in, if people have something they want to say, interrupt and say it, but you stop now.
Yeah, listen, I think that U.S. foreign policy, at least under the Biden administration, is wrestling with how to come up with a fundamentally new, expanded toolbox in its foreign policy. in no small measure driven by the fact that the world order is changing, whatever you want to call it. How do you create more strategic partnerships and alliances with rising middle powers, emerging powers, G20 powers? We don't have it. I'll give a very small anecdote. There's a push by the Biden administration, which will require Congress, always an uphill battle, to change some of the regulations about where US shareholder donations to multilateral development banks can be invested in middle income and higher middle income countries. The US by law is prohibited, and I'm not presuming any interest, for example, from a country like Brazil, but there's much that we're legally prohibited from doing because of arcane regulations that no longer make sense in a new world. And so it needs to shift. I think the UK, Europe, needs to also look at what can it do in a world where power is more diffuse to make its offer as a country, as a partner, more attractive. Because, and Ambassador Patriota can speak about this much better than I can, but the reality is, if I were advising a Latin American head of state, my advice would be play all of these countries off of each other as much as you can to advance your own specific national interests. The point being that it's all much more gray than the dichotomy that you laid out, both in terms of countries' internal political processes and how relations between countries need to function in a world where power has become increasingly more diffuse.
Ambassador, what your take on that?
I'd like to pitch in also. It's very complex, actually, and this would take us into a long conversation, but I'll try to summarize. On one hand, I must say that the Biden administration has been very supportive of our bouncing back as a democratic, fully democratic country, which happened a year ago. Both our countries were assaulted in our institutions. The January 6th assault on the Capitol and the Brasília Praça dos Três Poderes, the Three Powers Square. And it was interesting to see how the Biden administration was supportive of our electoral process, which led to a transition and to the full empowerment of the current Lula government. So that is greatly appreciated. We also appreciate the fact that the U.S. has been trying to reach out in areas that are priorities for Brazil. There was a recent pact signed by Presidents Lula and Biden on improving workers' rights. That was quite significant. Again, going back to Security Council expansion, which is something of strategic importance to Brazil, the U.S. has been more positive and forthcoming than China. So that's another interesting aspect in the equation. On the other hand, China is by far our number one trading partner, and Brazil is a rare country that has a huge surplus with China. Last year, bilateral trade reached 100 billion US two-way, and I believe about 40 billion of surplus. So a very important ingredient in our own development, in our own economy, although an obstacle to Security Council expansion. You know, whenever we have a BRICS meeting, one of the most difficult paragraphs to negotiate is the one where Brazil, South Africa, and India try to introduce the idea of expansion in both categories of members, and China resists very strongly because I don't think it's something dealing with Brazil specifically, but it's not interested in having more permanent members from their part of the world. So this gives you a sense of how Brazil...
Is that because the Chinese don't want the Brazilians, or they don't want the Japanese on the...
I think it has to do with Japan and India, of course. And they have told us it has nothing to do with you. It's not personal. It's not Brazil specific, but still. But finally, let me say something else about, you mentioned two visions, one more democratic, one more autocratic. It's clear to everyone in the audience who represents what in this... let's say, bipolar situation that is emerging. However, in Latin America, the United States carries some baggage. You know, it has supported autocratic regimes in the past. And even within its Summit for Democracies, it seems at times that it's trying to create an alliance of like-minded countries that will be supportive of the United States and against another group of countries. So I think it's important to note that in President Lula's address to the Summit of Democracies, he was very clear in saying, we do not believe the concept of democracy should be raised for creating walls or excluding voices. So our view of the democratic, let's say, democratizing international relations is one where you need to be inclusive rather than side with one hegemonic party or another.
Thank you, Maria. Now, just before we started, Maria and I were talking, but we were saying about the changes of the presidencies across the whole succession of Latin American countries that, on the face of it, appear to be switching to a leader with a less overtly pro-US set of instincts. But you were of the view that we shouldn't read too much into that. You could expand more generally, but on the US, but that particular point, I thought, with the exception, obviously, recently of Argentina, but otherwise, there appears to be a sort of trend in the last 3-4 years. But are we finding a trend in what is actually a set of separate elections that shouldn't be seen as a collective? You could, on that or other wider points on the US.
Yes, I think that the trend had to do more with a trend of rejection of incumbents, right? Like the thing is that rejection of incumbents resulted in more leftist leaders being elected in the region. But that was basically because the previous electoral cycle resulted in center-right and right-wing administrations in office that struggled to deliver, right? They face very high demands, tight fiscal accounts, the pandemic, like people were really unhappy with their leaders, and that provided benefit or that gave the impulse to the other side of the political spectrum, right? So you had Petro elected in office after Duque, you had Lula coming back in Brazil after Bolsonaro, Castillo being elected in Peru, Boric in Chile. You had very disruptive and very polarized elections as well, which resembles a bit of what we are looking in the US. The center was in many cases left out of the story, right? The center wins a second round, but it really struggles to get to the second round, particularly when you have so much political fragmentation. So now that we have these leaders in office, and we are seeing the other ripple effect of the public discontent, right? They get in office with a strong demand for change. They campaign on very ambitious reform agendas. They create a lot of expectations, and once in office, these...
But beyond the domestic, does it change the way Latin America looks at the world? I mean, for example, it could be a sort of a crunch flashpoint at the moment. Countries that are sympathetic to the Israeli position and countries that are sympathetic to the Palestinian position, okay? Sure, much more nuanced, and we could be sympathetic to both, but you understand, to force a polarization, has the change in leadership in a whole succession of countries in Latin America meant that the first instincts of the leaders are different on an issue of that type than would have been the case 5 years ago?
Yes, in some cases, but then if I can, finish the idea, what this means is that basically if you have all of these leaders struggling to meet expectations, you can expect that the next electoral cycle is going to result or to benefit, again, the other side of the political spectrum, and that we are going to see change elections happening. And that's what we are already seeing in countries like Argentina, or what we have just seen in Chile, for instance, with the rejection of the first constitution and, now a second constitution. So my point in here is that even though you have had some sort of shifts in the geopolitical or more leadership position towards some global issues, you cannot really expect for these.
And as we were saying earlier, Mexico is not likely to be a pendulum, or El Salvador in a week's time.
Mexico is probably going to be an
Different
exception this year, right?
Yeah.
I would just, again, reject for U.S. interest that the trend of elections, first of all, I don't think the U.S. was a major motivating factor in any of these elections in either which way, but I can point to a number of examples of more conservative-leaning heads of state in the region with which the United States had more difficulties subsequently to be replaced by a more left or left of center. Biden-Bolsonaro relationships were terrible, for example. We're in a different level now with Lula. Same thing with Boric.
Would a Trump-Lula relationship be a good one, do you think?
So I think what we saw from Trump's first term is a very transactional, personal approach to foreign policy that can cut in ways both good and bad. People did not necessarily think, based on some of the rhetoric over the migration issue, that a Trump administration and a López Obrador administration would find common ground, and yet they did. I don't predict that happens necessarily again, but it could.
Pyongyang, yeah.
Can I
Let me frame it this way. the US losing market share in Latin America to China. Of course it literally is in trade terms, dramatically, incrementally, but dramatically. But is it in influence terms? You're the director of the Americas. Is the Americas a less coherent whole than it would have been had you been doing that job 15 years ago?
So, just quickly on elections, I mean, it's quite impressive the number of peaceful shifts of power from one side of the political spectrum to the other side of the political spectrum. And, decades ago, I don't think you'd have expected to see a move from a quite, pick your country, quite right to centre government to a quite left to centre government. You've seen that across the region. I agree with the basic analysis that it was about incumbency and about domestic factors rather than anything bigger. But coming to the question, look, clearly the world is a very different place to post-Cold War 1990s, right? We are in a very different world. I think that I struggle with the idea of market share, right? In this, it makes it too binary, it's too numerical. Obviously, on trade, you can go for pure market share, but I think and I hesitate to speak for countries, but that's not, I don't think countries think, okay, how much am I going in with America and how much am I going with China, and am I going to dial up this and am I going to dial up that? It's a more varied pitch than that. And I think, countries are looking at, okay, we want a partnership. Most countries, we trade with China. The minister was talking about it earlier. Most countries are looking at how they best pursue their national interests, their values, prosperity and safety of their people in the world as they find it. Now that will inevitably, you will inevitably do more with China than you would have done in the 1990s. China is a larger presence on the international scene. Now, so there will be evolution in that, but I think thinking of it as a binary, something dialing up, something dialing down, doesn't quite work. It's about our partnerships with countries, and as I say, there is that values bit on democracy, on how we see climate, expansion of the Security Council, whatever you want, where actually there is a broader set of things than simply kind of money and trade that goes into how we work with Latin America, how Latin America works with the US, that isn't without its baggage, isn't without its history, but kind of transcends the simple money and things. So I think step away from the binary. It's about a partnership. Obviously, all countries are trying to get the best for their people and their nation. We have a role in trying to work with them, to encourage a sort of democratic, prosperous sort of international rules-based system.
Let's come to that in questions, because does it matter? Maybe it doesn't. I mean, of course, you can trade with China and be a democracy. Of course, you can. But does it matter that if you're sitting in Washington, D.C., does it matter that virtually every country in South America now does more trade with China than it does with the U.S.?
I'm sure it does matter. In a word, I just think it's the wrong question, with all due respect. If you accept or characterize the world in 1995 as unipolar, then there's an argument to be made, since we're no longer in a unipolar world, that the United States has lost quote-unquote market share because of broader geopolitical shifts in the world in every region of the world. This goes back to the point I was making about Washington, London, and others need to come up with a new toolbox and how it's going to pursue foreign policy and its geostrategic alliances. I don't think, given tensions in the US-China relationship, that you can frame it any other way. But the actionable conversation, it's not there, right? It's not about relative market share or not. What are you going to do?
Okay. And last one before we go to questions. Everyone, rather than talking about these sort of flashpoints in other parts of the world, let's start with the ambassador. Where is the best opportunity in the next 10 years for Latin America to provide global leadership? Which areas should we look to where the heads will turn and the Latin Americans will be in the spotlight and they can take forward global debates for the wider good of mankind, if you like. Ambassador, what would you see as the sort of
Well,
key
again, for the sake of synthesis, I think I would speak more about South America than Latin America.
Yeah.
South America has a certain geographic coherence. I mean, if you look at the map, it looks vaguely like Africa, and it's linked to the rest of the Americas by a canal, just as Africa is linked by the Suez Canal to Asia. So there's a logic within South America. And I think one of the great interesting strengths of South America is that it's self-sufficient in food, in energy, in water, and in a number of minerals. So in fact, in a more fragmented world, South America would be relatively well placed to be self-sufficient and to develop individually. Of course, this is not our objective. I think most South Americans would like a very strong engagement with the rest of the international community. But one area where there's an obvious comparative advantage is in the energy transition towards renewables. So in this sense, Brazil is the one country within the G20 with the cleanest energy matrix. So 45% of our energy matrix comes from renewables, and if you look at electricity generation, then percentage is much, much higher. I think the world average is something like 14. There's scope for solar, wind, but also hydrogen, green hydrogen, to be a factor in this equation. And all of this within, let's say, comparatively peaceful and predictable environment. Of course, again, you have to look at individual cases, but if you look at the agenda of the Security Council, there are only 2 items that pertain to Latin America and the Caribbean, Haiti and Colombia. And neither of the 2, I think, you could consider a threat to international peace and security, either to the Dominican Republic or to Colombia's neighbors. They're more in the nature of post-conflict consolidation of a peace agreement in Colombia, and in Haiti more a challenge of public security, I would say. By the way, I would differentiate between international peace and security and public security, because the strategies to combat organized crime, drug trafficking, etc., are of one nature. They're domestic. They pertain to public security. The strategies for pacifying or dealing with tensions between 2 or more countries are of a different nature and are international.
Thank you. Well, Rob, sitting in the Foreign Office, where do you think, where do you... Because I know, because I've been in the Foreign Office, you sit there and people say, no, we've got to have a discussion about China and the European Union and Russia and the US, and very important to talk about the Middle East, and you think, well, when were they going to get to the Latin American bit of the conversation? So you have to have the opportunity where you can dive in and say, but wait, this is where we, Britain, see Latin America as leading the global debate in the next 10 years. And you would say...
Yeah. So you're right. Look, as a geography, Latin America is
or South America.
unless something goes seriously badly wrong. And Latin America isn't the number one geography in the Foreign Office, because there's all sorts of other things that crowd that out. But when you go through the themes that we spend most of our time talking about, Latin America is pretty essential. I would agree that it's clearly got a USP around green energy, around diversity, around the broader sort of climate agenda. You've got a set of governments who are really interested in it, driving it, have been driving it for a long time. That includes oceans as well as the Amazon. There is around that space, and obviously Brazil looking forward towards COP. You've got a huge and consistent driver around that. And now other regions play their role as well. But I think if there is one region where you look at it and say, but it goes beyond that when you're talking about, as I say, a lot of the issues, especially in the Geneva bit of the UN, whether that's health, whether that's trade, whether that's human rights, actually the Latin American voice is really strong, important, and often kind of aligned with where we are.
Maria, next 10 years, where's the opportunities?
I guess that it's quite relevant what Ambassador Patriota said, but because that can give some leverage in terms of the relations between Latin America and the rest of the world, right? So first it was 5G, now it's critical minerals, right? Like lithium, copper. So that also helps in terms of the positioning of these different countries in order to sort of like attract a bit of attention, or attention that is now deviated to other areas, precisely because of the issues that are under contest under contest, and particularly in this context of greater resource nationalism?
I don't have much to add. I think my fellow panelists here have covered the terrain pretty well.
Okay, let me, in that case, invite you to add. Is it a source of regret to you that the fellow panelists didn't say what might be seen traditionally as sort of harder-edged commitments around military, for example, assistance?
Is that a disappointment or a surprise to me?
Disappointment?
No.
Because some might, I don't want to push you, but there wasn't, you could say these conflicts are not where Latin America or South America is looking to be on Russia, Ukraine, for example. They're not the go-to part of the world for trying to resolve that.
Well, I heard you asking specifically about military might, power, projection, and involvement. I think in terms of diplomatic negotiation, finding political solutions, I think Latin America and most of the international community has a vital role to play. I also don't want to give short thrift to many of the global security contributions that the region already makes. We just heard earlier this morning, for just one example, about the vast leadership role over decades that Uruguay has played in terms of UN peacekeeping. When it comes to Russia, Ukraine, or any other of the conflicts in the world, it is incumbent upon actors on both sides of the conflict, I think, to make their case. I think that case is grounded for those in support of Ukraine on many of the shared democratic values, UN Charter requirements, right, that both of these regions so vehemently defend over decades.
Good. Right, let's have some questions. So we'll try and keep a bit pacey. Let's take 2 or 3, and then the panelists can delve into bits and pieces that interest them. So the chap at the back, second from back.
How do you see human trafficking, modern slavery is at an all-time high throughout our entire history? How do you see Latin America, South America tackling that once and for all and finally bringing organized crimes, human trafficking, to an end?
Thank you. Don't answer yet. Let's I'll come to it in a bit, just because it's a bit unfair on Bianca to keep. Yes, take the 2 here, and then both of those.
Hello, I'm a master's student at Browne University. My name is Luisa. I'd like to pose this question mainly to the ambassador, but all of you experts are, of course, very welcome to share your opinions. Do you believe that there's still a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of the West regarding the interests and drivers of countries in Latin America? So, as an example, you mentioned the Brazilian tradition of diplomacy and the commitment to peace and neutrality, and this hasn't changed even in subsequent administrations that we've seen in the past years, which have been more or less biased towards one side or the other. So from a Brazilian point of view, more specifically, would you say that in the West, there's still a relatively primitive understanding of how complex, for example, the relationships with adversarial countries might be? And consequentially, how to essentially would the UK make a more attractive offer of its own?
Very good. We'll do one more, and then we'll come. So remember the chap here with the blonde hair.
Hi, Mansell here. Question. Geopolitical change since basically 90s. We have new players on the arena, coming with China, but also Iran, seeking the influence in the South Americas. What's your intake on that, since the Iran rather have a not Western point of view on how the political and Geneva Convention, for example, and the principles of it should deal with it? How the cooperation with the countries like Iran in the area have the influence on that?
Thank you. Okay, so we have human trafficking, Iran,
And
of course, join the
primitive
BRICS,
understanding.
but we'll start with the ambassador of the middle question, which is about the lack of understanding in Britain and maybe the wider West, or one might argue, lack of understanding. Primitive levels of understanding, unsophisticated levels of understanding of what Brazil is seeking to achieve and how it sees the world and its ability to contribute to the world.
Right. Well, I actually welcome that question because I do believe that there is an incomplete understanding, let's put it that way. I don't think it's primitive, but, and for example, the fact that Brazil adheres in a non-selective way to international law. Now, this is not always well understood. We condemn violations of international law by whomever they are made. We are not selective in this regard. It's not because we're closer to a country or less close to a country that we will try to skim over these situations, because they're very corrosive of the international system. And indirectly, they encourage others to do the same. So I think this very fundamental aspect is not always well understood, because there is a tendency of with us or against us, no matter what. I think the classic example is the war in Iraq, and I need not belabor that. There were even countries in Europe itself who were very much against, because it was seen as illegal and being carried out. Well, it turned out it was carried out on a false pretext. We equally condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In fact, we were the only country within the BRICS group to do so systematically at the United Nations. So that's one aspect that I would like to see better understood and more valued, because I think it's a contribution to predictability in international relations. I think the more countries behave like this, the better international system we will have. I would, however, I think you use the word neutrality. I think the word neutrality does not apply to Brazilian foreign policy, because when you run the risk of displeasing certain countries, especially by standing up for international law and international humanitarian law, for example, now in the case of Israel and Gaza, you're not remaining neutral. You're expressing a very strong commitment to a body of rules and laws that the international community has adhered to, and that I think should encourage better, improved cooperation among all.
Thank you. Oh, and while you've got the floor, Iran is quite because Iran was a notable invited to join the expanded BRICS
Yeah, I
group.
think I should add that Brazil is a country without enemies. We have diplomatic relations with all United Nations members. We have a very large network of embassies, including an embassy in Iran. Engaging with countries does not mean approving of their policies necessarily. You know, Brazil is a very free society. So societies that discriminate against women, where LGBT rights are not respected, are not similar to our society. And yet, we don't find that isolating countries is a good idea either, because you create resentment, you create, future problems at another stage in the road. I would add that China just played an interesting role in helping Iran establish relations with Saudi Arabia. And Iran is, let's say, normalizing its diplomatic relations within its own region, which is something we welcome. Iran is a country with long history and very impressive diplomats, very sophisticated understanding of its region. And I think any important or deep discussion on security within the Middle East or broader Middle East will necessarily have to include countries that are not Arab, like Iran and Turkey.
Very good. Now, Pandit, please don't feel you need to tackle every question. Tackle the one that you think you have the thing you really want to say about, or one or two issues. But again, human trafficking, failure in the West to understand. Maybe actually, Rob, you should do the failure in the West to understand, and Britain and Iran.
Let me do a word on that, right? I think I like to think that we kind of understand reasonably well where Brazil's coming from. Now, clearly, there are points at which we disagree or have a different emphasis, right? We are clearly more ready to see the need for consequences for actions that concern us, or break international law, and to deliver those consequences, whether that's sanctions or, as we've seen in the Red Sea over the last few weeks. So I think we understand where Brazil is coming from. Maybe not well enough. We could always do better, but I think there is a divergence on some of the means that we think we need to use as an international community to address actions, as well as obviously the diplomacy that goes alongside that. We have an embassy in Iran and all sorts of other places as well. We do the diplomacy, but there is a I think we see a stronger role for a sharper edge than Brazil probably does. Look, just coming on to the human trafficking, I think it sort of goes to the heart of what I sort of said at the start about that sort of ability of the state to provide sort of public security. And that is a challenge, not in every country in every way, but I think that's a challenge across the region and in many countries. And it's not just sort of human trafficking, there's a whole range of crimes that the state really struggles to force out. We do work with many countries in the Americas to try and help do that, but it's clearly a really serious domestic political challenge. And, you know, Iran, I don't think we should overstate their presence in Latin America, but equally there are some worrying aspects to it.
Do you want to expand on those or
No?
Okay. I thought you were.
I mean, I can do, but yeah.
And that's probably the area in which there's a scope for more cooperation and assistance, right? Like we're not really talking only about human trafficking, it's everything, right? It's drug trafficking, it's illegal mining, it's extortion, it's you name it, right? And this whole like sort of like transnational crime that really has a strong impact domestically, I think that it's going to be the main issue driving the politics and the social agenda in many of these countries. And we are talking about countries that have weak state capacity and therefore you find administrations that are really struggling to deal with this situation, right? Ecuador is a perfect example of that. You can also see the broader like link between this and politics, right? With the murder of a presidential candidate and the political impact that this is going to have in the future, as I mentioned, in the case of election, or even the other way around, which is quite interesting, right? Like how something like what happened in Ecuador can actually open suddenly the way for reforms that would have otherwise been really difficult to achieve, right? If it wasn't in this position.
Any of those subjects take your particular fancy?
Just very briefly, I think the point on trafficking is very well taken. We've been talking more about geopolitics and Latin America's place in the world, but I do think that public security, certainly from a U.S. perspective, these vast swaths of undergoverned spaces, it's not just human trafficking. There's a fentanyl crisis, for example, in the United States. This is something I think of grave concern. I think there's a lot of worry about where it could go. And it is a fundamentally, again, just to put very much my North American hat on here, it's very much what some call an intermestic issue for us. I mean, we're talking about people transiting borders being put into, we talked about US-Brazilian efforts to raise dignified labor standards. I mean, it's the opposite of that going on. We're talking about an epidemic in terms of fentanyl deaths in the country. I mean, this bleeds over to the very heart of the political discourse in the United States in an election year. So I think you were right to raise.
What did you make of Iran joining the expanded BRICS group, or for that matter, Argentina deciding not to join the expanded BRICS group? Is there anything interesting, wider implications?
So, you know, the outside of Brazil, I will confess that, you know, I'm not a BRICS expert. You know, my understanding was that the Chinese in particular had long been desiring for an expansion. Expansion has, you know, been, you know, on some level on the agenda for some time. There were already a variety of different governmental regimes in it. One observation that I have, if the membership of BRICS does become increasingly illiberal from a UK and US perspective, I think this goes back to a changing world order. That means that those consolidated democracies in that organization, the Brazils and the South Africas and the Indias, only rise in importance as an interlocutor for all of us to be speaking with.
Let's take another round of questions. I'm going to say the ambassador needs to go in 5 or 10 minutes, so it won't be a reflection on your question if he suddenly walks off the stage. Well, it may be, but it may be a coincidence that he both doesn't like your question and wishes to leave. We're going to take the one in the front, be waiting patiently, and then take the couple at the back.
Good morning. I'm Juan Pablo Toro, Athena Labs Executive Director. I'm very happy to be here with my friends of RUSI again. If Trump wins the next election, how do you see the relationship between the US and Latin America could evolve? Maybe more pressure against the Chinese presence in Latin America?
Must have a Trump question, so we've got one. Let's have a couple more, yeah. And then the woman.
Relatively broad question initially, and then a more pointed one. I was just wondering where you see the regulatory environment for agro-food supply chains developing on a wider level, but more specifically within the soybean commodity. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Lama Shahadi, I'm a reporter with The National. There were some recent arrests of Hezbollah, suspected Hezbollah members in Brazil in November, and I wondered what developments, or what are your concerns in light of the conflict in the Middle East that this could develop, something could develop in Latin America?
Thank you. I think, who cares what I think? But I think they're fascinating questions. And can I expand the middle one, which probably seems like the least cutting edge, but one of the facts I carry around with me the whole time is that Britain produces about 50% of the food that we consume, and Argentina produces over 1,000% of the food it consumes. So Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and others, massive net food exporters, particularly to Asia. And obviously that is significant, especially with the still rising global population. But Trump and ideological terrorism as distinct, I mean, the ambassador made a distinction between, organised crime, violent disorder, and, if you like, whether either state actors supported or not, but more ideological-based terrorist threats. Who'd like to, any one of those particularly? Let's do Trump. Everyone wants to talk. Always wants to talk about what they do. Everyone pretends that they're above it, but everyone wants to talk about Trump. I mean, he is. I mean, transactional is one way of putting it, but he is a big figure. He expresses his views forcefully. It would certainly be a change from Biden's style. How would you see that change?
Well, thank you for giving me the floor, because indeed I'll have to apologize for having to leave in 2 or 3 minutes. I find that, indeed this is the scenario that plays out in the United States. It's a big challenge for everyone around the world. So I think the more progressive democratic forces will have to unite. We didn't talk too much about the European Union today, for example, but I would be very much in favor of stronger relations between Latin America and the UK and Latin American and European countries where strong democratic roots have developed. Because one thing I may say is that if the other candidate running for Brazilian presidency had been elected and Trump wins the White House now, I would be very concerned for the future of Brazilian democracy. So I think we managed to escape that worst case scenario, and I believe that Brazil will be an increasingly strong advocate for democratic rule nationally and internationally. For a country that has 4 ministries dealing with human rights today, racial equality, gender equality, indigenous rights, and an umbrella human rights ministry as well, one thing that would concern us very much is, let's say, the less tolerant discourse that we see coming from the extreme right, not only in the United States, but in other countries, white supremacy, etc. This, I think, is completely incompatible with our values and would really, really raise, let's say, a level of unprecedented alarm, because we are used to dealing with highly developed Western countries as models of human rights and other values that we cherish.
And before you walk out the door, will you do a little bit on Islamist
Hezbollah.
terrorism, Hezbollah, potentially.
Hezbollah.
Ambassador didn't say he was previously ambassador in Egypt, so he has some.
That's right, it's true, and I just spent 3.5 years in the Arab world. I have to say that Brazil has been fortunate, comparatively fortunate, not to have been the target of any major terrorist attack to my knowledge, or even minor for that matter. Argentina has, for example, which does not mean we are not vigilant. For example, when we hosted the football, we didn't talk about football, by the way, the whole World Soccer FIFA tournament, or the Olympics, there was a very significant concern that something might erupt, and many agreements to cooperate with different countries around the world emerged at that time. So there is vigilance, but there is no sign of anything that would be, let's say, that would really raise a higher level of concern at this point. There's a very large community of Arab descent in Brazil, predominantly Christian. So more than 10 million Brazilians, that's more than in Lebanon, are of Lebanese and Syrian descent. Also a sizable Jewish community of about 150,000. And Brazil is one of the few countries in the world that I know where Jews marry Arabs, and they live very happily. So I don't see why this can't happen in other parts of the world as well.
That's a good note for you to walk off the stage.
Thank you so much.
Rather than England's lamentable performance in the Brazilian Football World Cup. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Which of those, maybe everyone should get to leave individually like that with a round. It's quite a nice way of doing which of those subjects, well, it's compulsory to do Trump and then you can pick one other. How about that, Rob?
So look, I'm not going to follow the invitation. And look, in the end, we respect the US, as democracy in the same way we respect democracy elsewhere. We work with whoever the US choose to put in the White House. We've worked with President Biden very, very well. We've worked previously with President Trump very well. If we will work with whoever wins the election, and I'm sure it will be positive and productive. So that I think is as far as we want to go on that. But just to pick up on the threat question. I mean, look. So I'm responsible for our sort of travel advice to British nationals, obviously responsible for embassy security and things as well. The threats that I worry about are still much more the threats we've talked about in terms of crime and violence, anti-natural disaster, much more than they are of that sort of threat. That doesn't mean, as Ambassador says, we're not vigilant, we're not looking, we're not being careful. But I think in this region, the threat, the security risks are still much, much more the crime and violence threat than targeted terrorism.
Will any of those questions take your fancy?
I mean, in Trump, right? Like, we can talk about for an hour about the potential impacts. I guess that we can distinguish like two types of sort of impact. The impact directly on the region and countries more specifically. And on that, I would say that there are some countries that have already dealt with Trump, right? And that will continue to be the case. It matters more, or it will have more of an effect on specific areas and countries in particular. Think of Venezuela, for instance, and the recent relaxation of sanctions, or Central America, right? And that's quite important. But then we have to look at the broader effect and sort of like the ripple effects of a Trump election on the region, right? And probably you have more to add on that, right? But what does this mean for US-China? What does this mean for the Middle East conflict, in which clearly Trump will have a very particular view? What does this mean for Russia-Ukraine, right? So it is on that broader issue where Latin America can also be indirectly, but very much affected.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think Maria makes a lot of good points. What are some of the things we could expect from Trump 2.0 in the Americas? I think some version of the quote-unquote maximum pressure strategy in Venezuela, assuming that we don't see fundamental shifts before that team would take power next year. That's one example. I think you will see a lot more systematic targeting, certainly in terms of rhetoric, of countries that are both migrant source and migrant transit countries. I think you could see policies that look to be more punitive in that regard. I think that you also need to look at how the Trump administration has wielded industrial policy to achieve geopolitical objectives. Ambassador Patriota has left, but I'm sure he recalls the implementation of Article 232 tariffs on Brazilian steel, right? And there is a hardening consensus in Washington across the political spectrum about the existential threat posed by Beijing under this current political leadership. And so that aesthetic or vibe, as I'll say, from Trump of you're either with us or you're against us vis-a-vis China, I think will return. And I think much of what we've discussed today is that fundamentally is not how Latin America sees the world, and that will inevitably lead to increased tensions. That said, very briefly, we also saw Trump in his first administration develop a number of productive relationships in the region. He will be welcomed by many for a variety of different reasons, whether ideological, whether because of less interest in certain issues like civil society protections, full democracy, right? This is not a black and white picture, it is gray. The last thing I will say is that there is a big push amongst those around the Trump campaign looking at US domestic economic policy to make a huge deregulatory push across a slew of relatively autonomous independent agencies within the US executive branch. I'm talking about the Fed and a number of other things. That could have very real implications writ large for the global economy, but particularly Latin American economies that rely on a certain amount of stability and transparency and standard setting on the regulatory front coming out of Washington. That could change.
Ron, take some more, because I don't want to overrun, and we've only got 5 minutes left, and it will just end up being messy. So let's finish with some concluding thoughts from the panel and give them more than 20 seconds, which would otherwise have been the case, to express them. Let me try and sort of frame those concluding thoughts, which is that we talked about, I mean, you said then about I'm interested in exploring this sort of tension between a world that is both more multipolar and more bipolar simultaneously, and where Latin American countries fit within that sort of mosaic, and how much they're forced to pick sides, or not forced quite, but feel that their interests may be served by picking sides to a greater extent than they might otherwise be comfortable with. How much can a country have a burgeoning relationship economically with China, but not see that as exerting influence on any other aspects of their foreign policy making, or how they vote in the United Nations, or whatever it might be? So I think whether Latin America likes it or not, it seems to me it might be accelerated by Trump if he wins the presidency, or it may not, but that you have this potential for a more of a sort of who's lining up with whom, and who's naturally affiliating with whom, I mean, just in so much as that is resistible, can it be resisted? And if it isn't, how will Latin America or South America play into that? So, because that seems to be, that sort of feels like the big hard-edged question. And then beyond that, any final thoughts or ideas you want to leave the audience with? Minute or two each? Well, who wants to go first? Maria, why don't you?
I think that the key aim of most Latin American countries will be precisely not to be pushed in a situation to take sides, right? To avoid taking sides as much as possible, which could be manageable until it is not, right? And the question is if we are going to get into a type of situation in which the taking sides is unavoidable, because that will be particularly problematic for certain South American countries.
So let's give you, so things get more fraught over Taiwan. And this comes up more and more at the United Nations. How can we expect South American countries to play that issue?
Yeah, I really don't know. In full disclosure, I just don't. I like your characterization of these kind of overlapping dynamics of multipolar and bipolar all at once. And I also agree with Maria. I think really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, as we say in the States, is I am skeptical, even if a Trump-like approach, heavy hammer, us or them, I am skeptical in the context of the bipolarity, which I assume you are implying China and the United States, that either side in the current world order is powerful enough and can make a convincing enough case to get at certainly middle powers, big countries, some of the larger economies in South America, for example, to just pick. It is fundamentally right now not in their interest to do so. And so I'm not trying to evade the question, but Trump pounded his chest a lot about Huawei contracts in Latin America, and yet he lost almost all of those concessionary debates, and he continued relations with many of those countries.
I thought, because you can tell from the way I speak that I'm British, I thought the question that was directed by the to the ambassador was an important one, because I think the instinct of a lot of British politicians, people maybe more generally, is to pick sides, is to think, we need to be on this side or on the other side. And I think one of the difficulties maybe sometimes is the instinct of a lot of leaders and maybe people more generally in Latin America is to avoid, in that scenario, picking sides, if possible. And it may just be that there is a sort of, as a result, there's a sort of potential understanding gap there of what the instincts would be of leaders in different, when faced with the same scenario.
I also think there's a history in which many Latin American countries in their recent history feel that they did pick sides in other geopolitical orders and it didn't go all that well for them. And that, again, is another reference to the baggage of the United States that Ambassador Patriota mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation. It's also a lived experience that didn't work out great. What lesson would you take from that? It's not some sort of de facto cultural preference.
But is that... No, we've done enough. Rob, you finish off on behalf of the British government.
So look, on that question, I think the idea of 100% picking sides is, there are votes at the UN, and if you want to be on the Security Council, you're going to have to vote. So you've got to pick a side, right? You've got to make a choice. And a lot of this, it's not that simple. And if you look at our China strategy, it's got various pillars, one of which is engage. So for us, a lot of this is about having countries having their eyes open, as we're trying to do, and say, this sort of Chinese behavior, or wherever, is a problem, but on this, we can talk. And so you're going to end up with countries, I think you're right, instinctively, most countries in Latin America won't want to pick a side. But I think it's a much more issue-specific thing of there are things, whether it's Huawei or whatever, that we worry about. Well, okay, we worry about, let's explain why we worry about it. On that, what are you going to do? So there's a choice on that. But it's not a global choice of, are you not going to sell your agricultural products to China? It's a much more nuanced conversation that says there are some things we really worry about. We want to talk to you about those. And on these things, we think there are real risks. On other things, of course, we engage, and other countries are going to engage. So I think it's a much more varied conversation. So look, sort of kind of final thought, coming back to the point about partnerships earlier, there is a huge amount that we do that isn't sort of big geopolitics, and the US does and others do, with individual countries. We've got a hugely deep relationship with Colombia on the peace process that's been going for absolutely decades. It's gone through a whole series of different presidents, right? And it's really important and valuable. things like that are replicated across the continent. And it's those sorts of relationships, I think, we don't talk about that much in these sort of, when we talk about big geopolitical and regional trends, but actually those are the sorts of things where we're really working in partnership together. It works for us, it works for the country, and the more of that we can do, the better.
What a nice note. We finish on a note that it's all quite nuanced, but it's good to work together, which is generally true of life, I think, probably. So thank you all. Thank you to the panel. Please show your appreciation to them.